French politics, the CEVIPOF, at Sciences Po in Paris. So he's a member of the International Board of Nations and Nationalism, which I think you all know. And he's the author of two books that are related to nationalism. Dire la France, on the study of the controversy of national identity in France in the 70s. And also Les Années Land, on the cultural policies of Jacques Lang during the Mitterrand years. So I think we're in for a treat, because he will be speaking about the French identity term, nationalism, multiculturalism, and republicanism in France. And so we'll, as any other plenary, we'll be speaking for a while, then we have time for any questions or discussions that we will have, and we'll try to finish a bit before 11:30. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Vincent.
Thank you very much. I don't think you hear me very well with this. Is that right? Okay. Thank you, Javier. Thank you, everyone. Dear colleagues in France, first a word to thank the ASEN Conference organizers for inviting me to propose me this lecture. This is really my pleasure and my privilege to be able to talk before this audience today at the 2023 annual conference. I've been familiar with this venue since the end of the 1990s, where everything began as a student in the MSc in Comparative Politics at the LSE. I discovered the field of nationalism studies in the marvelous lecture. I suppose some of you did. This is during this period that I started to investigate the question of French nationalism. I discovered John Hutchinson's arguments on cultural nationalism in his book, The Dynamics of Cultural Nationalism, I read, which was at the time thoroughly inspirational. And as I started to wonder whether this concept could apply to country France, 15 years later, I published this book called Dire la France, which is pretty difficult to translate in English, but it's about the narrative of French identity, as you can imagine, cultures and national identities in the 1980s and 90s, but in fact I started my study in the 60s and finished it up in the end of the 90s. What I'd like to talk about today is related in part to the issue of cultural nationalism, strongly, but it focuses more especially on the birth and evolution of identity politics in France since the late 70s in relation to multiculturalism, which is the heart of our conference this year. What I wish to demonstrate is that a type of French cultural nationalism was responsible for the formulation of a matrix of a French-style form of multiculturalism in the 1980s before undergoing a Republican conservative reversal at the end of that decade. I'll explain what is this Republican reversal. And since then, identity politics have largely contaminated the French political field, generating a mixed national narrative that did not totally bury its liberal foundations. So that's going to be the general argument. But before that, I'd like to start to talk about an argument about the theoretical nature of the type of nationalism I've been exploring of my research, because in the sense that even if I'm going to speak about France, I think we could maybe take a little time trying to think why cultural nationalism is an interesting concept to study civic nations, for instance. As I said, when I started to work in the field, I wanted to demonstrate that the concept of cultural nationalism could be fit to describe a form of French nationalism. It seemed to me that the sole analysis of the political nationalism carried by the extreme right of the National Front at the time already limited our understanding of nationalism as it was expressed in the political field and in French society. The main source of nationalism was not to be found in the margins of politics, but as Mick Billig taught us, in its heart. The majority parties, the state, intellectuals and artists are participated in the promotion of a different kind of nationalism, more diffuse and more central than the old ethno-historical nationalism whose roots and manifestations are well known to us. Furthermore, I noticed in the public speeches of political actors, a consensus emerged very early in France in the 1960s and 70s about the notion of culture. French culture was always described as the cement of national identity. That raised two questions to me. What identity was that? And what culture were we talking about? This is how I got interested in cultural nationalism. But to use the concept, I first had to discuss the usual definitions of this concept in the literature of nationalism studies. In the academic literature, and especially in the literature of ethno-symbolism, cultural nationalism is defined schematically as viewing the nation through the existence of a shared culture. That's the heart of what Hutchinson and Smith have told us about nationalism and cultural nationalism. It emphasizes the impact of cultural traditions and practices, cultural representations and language in shaping national identity. The analysis of the role and uses of culture in nationalist ideologies is one of the main conceptual issues in the literature and the theory of nationalism, as we know. The latter has been structured for several decades around lively debates on the cultural origins of nation states. But what about nations today? What role does culture play in the most contemporary forms of nationalism? For Smith and Hutchinson, the principle of cultural nationalism is seen as a process of transmission and reformulation by nationalist entrepreneurs of the traditions of ethnic communities. Hutchinson defines it by saying that, I quote, "The main objectives of cultural nationalists is to revive what they consider to be a collective, distinct and primordial personality with a name, specific origins, a territory, and social and political practices." This is modern nationalism, I think the called well, I think it was in this book. As opposed to Gellner, Hutchinson argues that the idea of cultural nationalism may exist on liberal and modernist grounds. Indeed, a common pride in the history and culture of the nation cherished social solidarity while being compatible with the principles of individual choice and autonomy within that culture. Although this definition paves the way for a modern and liberal understanding of cultural nationalism, it is not entirely, to my view, satisfactory to understand cultural nationalism as applied to a nation such as France, for several reasons. First, because the emphasis on a conception of the nation as an overarching cultural community is questionable. For Hutchinson and Smith, there's not only one distinct origin of the nation, but also only one homogeneous culture per nation state, once the construction is complete. But the common sense that nations are built around a totally coherent and stable identity seems to be historically inaccurate. While the mythification of the national narrative by the Third Republic in France played a major role at the end of the 19th century in creating a true national novel, a roman national, as we called it in France, there's no single homogeneous identity in that nation. Moreover, historical analysis has revealed that the perpetuation of nationalism, of the national model, is accompanied by a permanent redefinition of the type of attachment that links individuals to this nation. The relationship to the national community is moving depending on the nature of times. Smith and Hutchinson's definitions posit a distinct origin for the nation with a name, a history, and political and social practices, but to me it exaggerates the consensus around this origin and narrative. Another difficulty was that the essentialization of supposedly enduring ethnic identities has led to an overuse and blurring of the category of ethnicity in the symbolic version. It is used almost interchangeably with the term culture in the works of John and Anthony, the latter being considered the core of the concept of ethnicity. Our analysis of cultural nationalism in France focuses on the question of the cultural components of the civic nation, deliberately bypassing the latter's ethnic dimension. This is not to say, of course, that the issue of ethnicity is entirely irrelevant to understand French nationalism, of course, but it cannot be understood in the contemporary period by exaggerating the importance of this category. Finally, Smith and Hutchinson analysis is primarily concerned with understanding the emergence of nation-state, and as I said, they say very little about what is the current functioning of nationalism today. In other words, what Daphne Alighiopoulos and Andreas Wimmer has called the effect of nationalism in contemporary nations. So, my interest here was in the production of cultural nationalism. I have attempted to describe a form of French cultural nationalism constructed from above, in the top-down phenomenon, that is to say, constructed by the French states, by political and senior civil service actors, politicians, artists, people who exercise official functions or not. And the question was not really to try to wonder how cultural nationalism had been framed against the states, to take back the distinction proposed by Rogers Brubaker. It is the states in France that transform cultural identities into political identities and intellectual motive into legitimate official discourses. It is the actors at the head of states who imposed mythicized, homogenizing narratives relayed by public policies and standardized language, histories, ceremonies, museums, and schools, to use the examples given by Charles Tilly. Despite its importance, the state is not the only operator of cultural nationalism, and it's quite necessary to move away from a purely state-centered perspective in order to analyze the elaboration of national narratives in France. Some other actors play an essential role in legitimizing state cultural nationalism: intellectuals, cultural actors and institutions, artists, but also the national media. Taking all this into account, I've managed to elaborate a kind of new definition of cultural nationalism in France, and I define it as the following: as a modern principle that structures the national narratives elaborated by political elites and implemented by the state with the supports of intellectuals and artists. Cultural nationalism postulates the congruency of national and cultural narratives. Cultural issues, traditions, representations, practices, including language, are seen as essential components of national identity and as the main lens of the French interpretation of the world. In doing so, cultural nationalism formulates both a definition of French culture and identity, but also a French conception of what culture entails. Why is it important? It is based on changing beliefs, representations, and intellectual motives whose ideological presuppositions, modes of enunciations, and public manifestations evolve over time. So that's the first point I wanted to make, once again, as in a modernized version of what cultural nationalism meant in the context of France. So now that I've set this very brief definition on which we can come back in the discussion if you want, let me trace back one of the greatest political strife in the last 40 years in France on the issue of the definition of national identity. We know that this definition and defense of national identity has been at the heart of an intense political debate between liberals and conservatives in most Western democracies in the last decades. But what is maybe more surprising is that France has been the laboratory of these debates since the 1970s. My argument is based on a double discovery. First of all, against the accepted view that conservative and radical right parties invented identity politics in the years 2000, which is a bit the common sense or conventional wisdom when we think about nationalism today, the idea that the right and the extreme right would be at the heart, and many people have talked about it, think of course about Daphne Alikoglu or Sofia Vassilopoulou, and they've been writing great length on this issue. Well, actually I've found that on the contrary it is the left, and more especially the French Socialist Party, imported identity politics in the political game in France and modernized it, mainly by embracing minority inclusion and denouncing a threatening American cultural invasion in the 1970s and 80s. The originality of the French case, as I said, is in part of chronology, a transformation that elsewhere took place in the 90s and the year 2000 started to take place much earlier in the 1970s. That's the first discovery. My second discovery is that while the controversy over national identity now in most Western democracies and elsewhere focuses on immigration, the relationship with Islam, secularism, this was not always the case. Okay? Throughout the 1980s, it was cultural policies and debates on French culture and its social function that nourished identity politics in France. Not, once again, that immigration didn't play a part in it, but we'll see that it played in a very different way than it is used today. My project here, in this book, which cover that you see, was to enlighten the hidden genealogy of the debate around national identity in France, which led me to realize that the French Socialist Party used the objectives, discourses, and content of cultural policy as a framework for the elaboration of a left-wing, liberal national narrative aiming at making culture the cement of national identity. By adopting a perspective that extends beyond the extreme right, I wanted to connect debate, usually studied in isolation. There is in fact a hidden connection between the controversy over national identity, cultural policies, the defense of French culture and artists, the fight against cultural or American cultural imperialism, which is the name that it was given in the 1980s, multicultural policies known as the right to difference, and the concept of the exception culturelle française, the French cultural exception, which was made famous in the early 1990s. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. First of all, why and how did the left start talking about identity? In France, of course. The parallel here with the civil rights movement in the US is very much enlightening. The French Socialist Party underwent a full transformation in the aftermath of May 68 that led it to embrace the defense of French culture in all its form, and even more importantly, the defense of all minorities. The idea of François Mitterrand's party was both ideological and strategic. In terms of ideas, and that's, I think, very important because I think you can generalize it to many other socialist parties in Europe at the time, the socialists developed a radical critique of industrial society and the mechanization of human relations through work. In the context of a growing questioning of identity in capitalist society, culture was thought as a tool for rerouting the individual in his environment. The 1970s saw the emergence of the idea of a right to roots, a right to identity, a particularistic claim to identity that involved a redefinition of culture, not only perceived as a cultural heritage or set of artists, but also as a set of ways of life. And once again, the use of culture as a way of life was absolutely central for redefining culture as the center of the identity politics. In terms of strategy at the time, even though I don't want to lecture you on the history of French politics, but at the time of strategy in the 1970s, the idea was to distance themselves from the communist allies at the time. The socialists and the communists were allies in what was called the Union of the Left. But the communists needed to be, let's say, overwhelmed or supplanted, and the communists were completely indifferent to the question of identity. But the idea was also for the Socialist Party at the time to differentiate or to distance itself from the right, the French right that was in power at the time, which was denounced by the left as being sold out to rootless capitalism described as anti-humanistic. So therefore, in the run-up to the 1981 presidential election, which saw the election of François Mitterrand for the first time in 23 years, a left-wing government reached power in France, the French socialists began to promote a dual cultural nationalist discourse with new contours, and part of these contours were liberal and communitarian. The first dimension of the discourse displayed by the socialists before power, and even after they reached power in 1981, was to propose and promote and defend French cultural identity against American cultural interference in a policy that was called coca-colonization. The idea that the Americans, which is something that you found elsewhere also, especially in Mexico, for instance, but the idea that American culture was invading other cultures and destroying the roots of these cultures, and especially identity. So therefore, as a riposte to this, from 1981 onwards, the promotion of national culture took the form of a systematic defense of French artists, but also of a policy of influence aiming at attracting intellectuals and artists from all over the world to witness the political and cultural change that started in France in 1981. Support for artists, the promotion of national culture industries, and the enhancement of a French art of life, or way of life, were key elements of this policy. And the fact that the socialists entertained a strong relation with artists all throughout the 1980s. Here on this picture, you see François Mitterrand on the right, which was at the time head of state, and on the left, maybe with Yves Saint Laurent, and Catherine Deneuve, one of the most famous actors at the time. We have another picture of this idea. Here, for those who know Mediterranean French culture, you can see that lady at the forefront of this picture is Dalida, the French singer from Egyptian origin, Egyptian-Italian. And here's the intronisation of François Mitterrand as president on the 21st of May 1981, which is really at the center of the picture. Several artists came here to show their support to François Mitterrand. Once again, that's not in detail. At the time, that was the heart of the new policy of the Socialist Party. And let's not think here like in other countries, cultural policy was a minor element of François Mitterrand's campaign. On the contrary, it was at the heart of the campaign. The idea of François Mitterrand was that culture, or let's say socialism in his view, and he mentioned it just before being elected, socialism was or what he called socialism of freedom, was a cultural project. And he meant that culture would be at the center of his mandate as president. So once again, culture here was considered as a key of the national narrative displayed by the socialists, not only during the campaign, but in the first term of François Mitterrand as president and with his prime minister, the minister of culture. Okay, here, this is the type of criticism you could find also in the press, especially in the Monde, which is a cartoon saying that American summer, and you have like French people dressed as cowboys, you know, in the 1980s. I love French TV, it's so American, they're speaking in English. So this is the idea also to denounce what would be a linguistic and cultural invasion of the French mind. I'll say a word about it. Because in this process, the left, and I'm saying the united left, because the communists joined for obvious reasons, the socialists in this denunciation, denounced American cultural imperialism as a new form of colonization of French culture and imagination. Just to give you an example, for the funny side, Jean-Pierre Chevènement at the time was a socialist hero who would become several times minister in the 1980s and 90s, especially Minister of Higher Education. He declared in 1978, "It is time to react against the organized dumping down of our people before the solution left to our children to change their life will be to shoot up with heroin." So the idea that basically this very charged rhetoric, anti-American rhetoric at the time was absolutely commonplace within the French left. And it was, once again, one of the heart of an anti-model denounced by a socialist cultural nationalism. So again, this invasion of a so-called American subculture, it was proposed to promote French culture in all its form and to put in place protectionist measures to preserve its diversity against the forces of American alleged uniformization. That was the name, uniformisation. Okay? So this policy will lead to what will be called later, 20 years later, the l'exception culturelle, when France fought against the deregulation of cultural markets promoted by the US during the GATT negotiations in 1993. So this socialist cultural policy implemented after 1981 is undoubtedly nationalist. So because of its ambition to make French culture shine, okay? But at the same time, the defense of national culture in its socialist version should not be thought in terms of the categories of traditional ethno-historical nationalism. It refers more to the promotion of a bucolic and optimistic France, what Jacques Lang, the popular Minister of Culture at the time, called a right to beauty, the idea of a liberal nationalism as a vector of individual emancipation. That leads us to the second dimension of this partly liberal cultural nationalism, which was founded, and that's important even in today's conception of French nationalism, it was founded as a critique of Jacobinism, described at the time as a uniformizer and insufficiently recognized local identities. Recalling the discourse of the Third Republic, the Petite Patrie, that you may be aware of, the idea that the small identities feed the large identity, the Petite Patrie nourrisse la grande, the small patrie feeds the great nation of France. I can come back about it if you want. He praised at the time the motto, live and work in the country. Okay, so the idea was to promote a policy of systematic recognition of Breton, Basque, Corsican or Creole, French Creole cultural identities. This issue also encompassed the valorization of ethnic post-colonial minorities, which were described as a priority. National minorities, the Jews, the Gypsies, the Armenians, but also, above all, the cultures of post-colonial immigrants were the subjects of new policies of recognition starting in 1981. So this concept, or this matrix of a French form of multiculturalism was nicknamed, as the slogan, the right to difference. The idea was, we have the right to be different. And it was a major turning point in French politics. After the election of François Mitterrand, this discourse was coupled with cultural policy that strongly valued external cultural influences outside of American influence, particularly those of countries of the Third World. The argument developed was that what was called a cultural back and forth. The defense of French cultural identity could only be legitimate if it was accompanied by an openness to external cultural influences. So it led, for example, the socialist power to organize what he calls the foreign culture seasons, where a nation would be invited to display its culture in France through a series of events. Like the first one in 1985 was the Indian foreign season, but then there was the Brazilian foreign season, the Argentinian foreign season. Of course, every time the country was considered as a cultural friend of France. But also the nomination of important foreign personality within national cultural institutions. We have many occasions to witness that in the 1980s and 90s. So, I'll take a little time just to talk about cultural nationalism and multiculturalism in this respect. This transformation of the national narrative promoted by the left after 1981 contradicted the idea of a national community united around a single language by questioning the indivisibility of political citizenship and cultural citizenship. Rejecting the idea of a homogeneous cultural identity, it gave substance to an image of the nation nourished by a multiplicity of sub-national narratives, feeding a national narrative whose diversity constituted its singularity. At the national level, the socialist narrative signified the impetus of a policy open to sub-national cultural influences. Internationally, it claimed both the universalist principle of the right for each culture to emancipation, the equal dignity of each culture, and the recognition of a broad pluralism. In this sense, the cultural nationalism can be read as a proposal for a cultural democracy conceived as a form of multiculturalism based on exchange and, to a certain extent, métissage of cultures, but never on the total fusion of these cultural identities. It's interesting to see that at the time, this multicultural thinking that emerged in the 1980s and 90s, especially the 1980s, was based on the rejection of what was called capitalist cosmopolitanism. The idea of capitalist cosmopolitanism was the fusion of all identities into some kind of melting pot. This is not what the left in France tried to do. The idea was to recognize each and every one of the sub-national cultures and to entertain some form of dialogue among one another. The relationship between culture, nation, and pluralism can be summarized by a triptych: the right to one's own culture, you have a right to entertain your own culture, a right to culture as a whole, culture meaning arts and cultural heritage, and a right to community. You have a right to entertain your own community if you want. That forms a matrix of multicultural nationalism, to use the expression of Tariq Madood, which is, I think, very close from what he wrote, actually, even though, of course, he was designed earlier. According to this principle, each individual belongs by birth to an original culture, which he or she has the right to claim throughout all of his or her life, while cultural homogenization threatens these identities. National unity springs from the accumulation of differences, not from an impoverishing uniformity. The right to culture offers the possibility for individuals to deepen and reclaim these differences, which are sources of authenticity and creation, and to turn them into collective goods, provided that culture is considered as a specific good and not as a market, which was summarized by another creed, which was culture is not a product like any other. It shouldn't be on the market, basically. Culture is something else. The right to community as a place of fulfillment and as a refuge from the solitude generated by capitalist society must, above all, enable each individual to maintain a strong link with the most solid community, the national community. So here, communitarian nationalism should not be opposed, or let's say nationalism should not be opposed to the national community. On the contrary, national community is the umbrella under which this diversity can emerge and live. However, each citizen must be able to claim several communities, large and small, which are enriched by their diversity and differences. This conception of the nation was the backbone of cultural policies aiming at promoting French diversity in all its forms, and of official discourse favourable to multiculturalism, even if the word was never really uttered. Support for racial minorities through differentialist anti-discrimination policies, but also through the promotion of regional and immigrant culture, was a very strong feature of the period of the 1980s. Here, I'd like to show you a couple of images about that, or about the defense of national identity. I wanted to show you this construction of the Louvre, the pyramid of the Louvre, which was part of a big plan of what we call the Grand Travaux, the great works, in order to show, let's say, the prestige of French culture in the 1980s. And the Louvre was restoration of the Louvre was one of them. Here you see the marches in 1983, marches called the Marches for Equality Against Racism, also nicknamed Marche des Beurs, Beurs meaning Arabs, and the rest was second generation immigrants. And here you find a strange like this. The man you see at the center is Jack Lang, the former Minister of Culture in the 1980s, 90s. And basically the idea, it was a tract that was published very widely in a newspaper. And you can see different faces. I don't know if you realize that they're supposed to show ethnic diversity in France. And of course, all of them are at the same time from ethnic minorities, but also are artists in one way or another. So the idea was to show the new face of France, and you see here up on the right you have Eric, he's a comedian, Bob is a musician, and I think she's young, she's a stylist. On the right you have somebody who's a cartoon illustrator, and at the center you have just Jack, minister. And Jack, of course, is Jack Lang, the Minister of Culture. He's supposed to be not an artist, but among the artists promoting the face of diversity, which is also, once again, as I said, the recognition of ethnic minorities. And here, of course, is the symbol of the 1980s, SOS Racism, the main NGO supported by the state. Actually, it's an NGO, but it was very much connected with the Ministry of Culture, with their creed, Touche pas mon body, don't touch my body, which is the main anti-racist creed of the time. So, I'd like to end in the last maybe 5-10 minutes of this keynote to try to explain what happened since then. That was the 1980s, the formation of multicultural trends, but we know that this changed. We know actually that the right to difference will soon become a stillborn policy, fought by its opponents and even abandoned by its designers as early as the second half of the 1980s. So what happened? Several reasons explaining this shift. I'm going to be a bit more quick on this because I think they are less surprising to you and maybe a bit more known, but we can once again discuss it in discussion. First of all, as you may know, in 1983, a new political party appeared on the political scene. This new political party was the National Front. And the National Front restored a traditional nationalist discourse based on national identity and not national identities, but a single national identity, while denouncing the threats posed by immigration, a theme that took precedence over the criticism of communism, which was the very beginning of the National Front. And the French, like Republican rights, for its part, was very slow to understand that the Socialist Party in power was formulating a new national identity. I mean, it was very slow to understand what the left was trying to do, and that it took them time to understand that actually the Socialists were waging some kind of cultural wars in Gramscian terms, you know. But from the mid-1980s onwards, the French right started to develop a genuine identity-based response to the liberal cultural nationalism in the name of national unity. And this new discourse challenged the pluriculturalism promoted by the socialists. The French right, with the support of the National Front, accused the left of participating in the retreat of French identity through the recognition of immigrant cultures, the defense of minority cultures being accused of dividing France, and the word used was Limonize, which was a reference to the civil war in Lebanon. The idea that by recognizing minority cultures, you would create a division that would cause a civil war. That was clearly the argument that was put forward. And this argument actually works. By launching an identity counterattack, it developed a modern, conservative cultural nationalism that was distinct from the old ethno-historical Gaullist nationalist discourse from the 1960s. According to the right, there could not be several national cultures as the left claimed, but only one, the French culture, into which immigrants had to integrate and see their differences disappear. This was the birth of what was called later the French tradition of integration, which was actually completely reinvented in the 1980s, a debate that emerged in the second half of the 1980s. The left, on the other hand, persisted in its ambition of a cultural policy that recognized the diversity of culture, but it completely retreated from the apology of differences in the national narrative. What emerged, actually, rather than the right to difference, starting in the second half of the 1980s, even within the Socialist Party, was called the right to indifference, in the sense that the idea was not to promote differences anymore, but on the contrary, to foster on what united us as a nation, and not what divided us. The right to difference was fought against by a fringe of the Socialist Party, but also by the communists, who considered it to be, at least at best, an electoral danger, because public opinion did not accept it, and at worst, as a threat to national unity. And in a way, the communists and parts of the Socialist Party sided with the right by denouncing this right to difference. At last, another very important dimension, probably buried in the end, the right to difference, and this was the comeback of the Republican reference in French politics in the end of the 1980s. The fact that in the second half of the 1980s, with the collapse of Marxism as a legitimate ideology in the left, with the failure of some form of economic liberalism, with the right being in power between 1986 and 1988, well, there was a vacuum that was filled by most parties with a permanent reference to the Republic as the new consensual ideology of the times. And this comeback of the reference to the Republic in French politics at the end of the 1980s, it legitimized the idea that the production of common values, a condition for collective harmony, required a common culture. From then on, recognizing and promoting differences was deemed incompatible with the Republic and the unitary national narrative that it promoted. In the face of the political and intellectual attack that it represented, it was no longer possible to take cultural pluralism into account, into the national narratives. Indeed, it continues to be valued, but on the margins, under the cloak, to make way for an emphasis on the common culture, French culture. And once again, there was an equation that was formulated between cultural homogeneity as a condition to political equality. If you wanted a formal equality between immigrants and traditional French population, well, you needed to insist on what cultures, or one culture they had in common, rather than insisting on the differences. And this motto completely changed the face of identity politics. So I would end this keynote with a few thoughts about where are we now, actually? What is the state of nationalism and the fate of the old, partly liberal cultural nationalism today? Firstly, the grounds on which French nationalism is hinging today are significantly different from the 1980s. Secularism, laïcité, the EU and globalization, Islam, postcolonialism, and controversies about France's historical past are the new grounds of identity politics. They are also much debated subjects in society, sometimes reclaimed by new extreme right, more radical than the Rassemblement National. I'm thinking especially of the emergence of a new party called Reconquête, carried by a new extreme right populist leader called Éric Zemmour, who actually managed to reach 6% at the last presidential election last year in 2022. Yet, there's a question, do we witness, as Brubaker proposed as early as 2001, do we witness a return to assimilation and the end of the old cultural nationalism? I don't think so. I don't think we are witnessing a comeback to what we were before. On the one hand, Republican nationalism carried by a part of the center around President Macron and the right focuses on the cultural homogeneity deemed necessary for the formulation of a national political community. In addition, we have to admit that there is a particularly high threshold of far-right populist nationalism, which reached almost 40% of the votes for Marine Le Pen in the second round of the election last year. However, the left-right divide is still very strong on identity politics, as well as on multiculturalism, immigration, or the place of Islam. The new left coalition, called the NUP, that was formed in Parliament last year, revived recently the old liberal cultural nationalism, and now the fight has been starting again with a whole part of the political spectrum claiming what was once the motto of the Socialist Party, and that was abandoned in between. Moreover, conservative trends are constantly challenged by the reality of French society's pluriculturalism, creating a gap between political narratives that are mostly conservative on the notion of identity, and social realities that are much more complex and open to the valorization of French immigrant and local cultures. Despite the temptation of state-imposed cultural homogeneity, a social valorization of cultural diversity emerged in the year 2000s and expressed at several levels. Politically, it took the form of positive discrimination programs for the offspring of immigrants. Socially, it embodied a growing tolerance for individual lifestyle, a growing demand for differentiation of cultural offerings, and an increased curiosity about foreign cultures, while the rise of anxiety about the nation's border has not been accompanied by a significant decline in cultural liberalism, maybe except on immigration, even though, once again, needs to be discussed, because when there are several questions about, do you think there are too many immigrants? And actually we are about the same level as 1981. It's about half of the population say, yes, there are too many immigrants, which is too much, of course, but it's not significantly higher than it was 40 years ago. After decades of France being a laboratory of original forms of cultural nationalism, we are paradoxically witnessing a form of normalization of these debates, in the sense that they increasingly mirror the evolution of nationalism in the different countries of Western Europe. The debates look a lot more like they are in other countries than they used to be in the past. As elsewhere, the competition for political power is also more than ever a confrontation of nationalist narratives in search of legitimacy. And this is on this point I will conclude this lecture by coming back to where I started and quoting John Hutchinson and Anthony Smith, "Nation remain, from the point of view of nationalism, endless conflict zones." Thank you very much.
So thank you very much. So now we have around half an hour for any questions, and then we'll end up around 20 past 11 to take a picture. So if there's anyone that has a question, now we have time to ask or whatever. So yeah, okay, I think there's one question. Chris? Yeah.
Hi, thank you for that. It's very fascinating. My question